What makes for a fair trial in the United States legal system? The concept of fundamental fairness encompasses many issues, including the right to an attorney. But the attorney must be competent and the results of the trial reliable. But it doesn't always work that way. This is Clayton, Missouri, a suburb of St. Louis. It's a prosperous community known for its beautiful residential areas and its thriving downtown filled with offices, restaurants, and shops. On the morning of Friday, October 30th, 1981, an 80-year-old retired interior designer was found murdered in his home. One suspect admitted he was involved in the murder. He implicated a second man in order to avoid the death penalty. The second man, William Haynes, pleaded not guilty. This is a story of murder and the journey of Bill Haynes through the legal system. Daniel Robert Sprouse was born in Sandusky, Ohio, where he had a troubled childhood. He left Ohio shortly after graduating from high school and drifted around the country. In 1981, he was 26 years old and was wanted in 3 states for auto theft, stealing, and drug charges, among others. He was a charismatic, attractive con man. In August of 1981, he arrived in St. Louis using the name Stephen Romer.
I met him 81, I'm sure it had to have been August of 81. He was coming through town, and it was in a bar, a large bar called Bob Martin's at that time. It was on 20th and Chestnut Street in downtown St. Louis. Very, very, very good looking, and everybody seemed to really fall over their heels when they saw him, you know. So I thought I had a prize.
Steve moved into Gary's apartment, and Gary introduced him to many of his friends, including Bill Haynes. Gary and Bill met while working together at a restaurant some 10 years earlier and remained close friends. Bill Haynes grew up in Belleville, Illinois, and had been a chef and manager at a variety of restaurants. He had no criminal history and no history of violence. In 1981, Bill lived with his wife in a partially renovated historic home near downtown St. Louis. Gary began to have many questions about Steve. Steve had money and a variety of stories about his past.
Everything he said was just so outlandishly crazy. He was bragging all the time that his family had money, that he came from someplace in Phoenix.
Gary looked through Steve's belongings and discovered that he was really Daniel Robert Sprouse.
I confronted him with these, and he said, you know more than you need to know, and you better not say anything, because he said, I'll kill you. I would guarantee you that Stephen Romer was dangerous. Oh yeah. And a big liar, exaggerator. He was convincing. He was a very convincing person. He could tell you black was purple.
Gary asked Steve to leave, and Steve moved out. He stayed in St. Louis with other friends of Gary's and continued to call Bill Haynes occasionally.
If Romer had a talent for anything, it was gathering information in bits and pieces about people to put into his own little computer to pull out later.
Steve realized that Bill wanted to own his own restaurant and dangled the possibility of finding investors for him. John Barlow had been a widower for over 20 years. He lived alone in a luxurious condominium in Clayton. He met friends for lunch, often at his private club, and attended occasional dinner parties. One day in mid-September, Mr. Barlow was eating lunch at his club. Steve was his waiter. By that evening, Steve had moved into Mr. Barlow's condo.
He fell in love with him. Whenever they met, he really cared for him because he wanted nobody but Steve around him.
But Steve began seeing Mark Dufresne, a nurse. Dufresne often stayed with Steve overnight at Mr. Barlow's condo, which caused more friction in the home. During this period, Dufresne was arrested for stealing syringes, needles, and narcotics from the VA hospital where he worked. On Friday morning, October 30th, 1981, Roberta Terry went to work at Mr. Barlow's home as she always did on Fridays.
They always left the door open for me, you know, the back door open in the apartment. And when I came in, I couldn't get in, so I had to go downstairs to the manager, and we went up together. And so I flew right to the bedroom because I knew something had to happen for him not to have the door open for me, you know.
On the floor between the bedroom and the bathroom, she found Mr. Barlow's body. Clayton police found a letter in the living room signed Steve. They identified Steve as Daniel Robert Sprouse and sought him and his known friend, Mark Dufresne, for questioning. The autopsy determined that Mr. Barlow had died 2 days earlier on Wednesday evening between 9 p.m. and 11 p.m. He had suffered broken ribs and defensive wounds on his left side and had 2 needle punctures in the vein of his left arm. He had been injected with an unknown substance. Artwork and jewelry were missing. Police interviewed Novella Hayes, Mr. Barlow's other housekeeper, on the Friday the body was discovered. She explained that Steve Romer had taken over management of the household and described conversations she had with him in the days leading up to the murder. Romer showed Hayes 400 shares of Exxon stock and stated, "If I can get him to sign it 15 minutes before he dies, I could get out of here with $450,000. On another occasion, Romer referred to Barlow's substantial collection of valuable Oriental figurines and told her, "If something happens to Barlow, I'm going to walk out with all of those." He asked for her home address and told her that he would send her something nice in about 2 months. He stated, "I may need you to testify for me." On the Wednesday of the murder, Steve called Hayes at her home at about 5 p.m. and told her to take Thursday off. On Thursday, concerned about Barlow, Hayes tried to call several times but received no answer. Police spoke to Mrs. June Sprouse, Daniel Robert Sprouse's mother, in Sandusky, Ohio. She described her son as being mentally ill, having a split personality, one part of which was relatively mild-mannered, and the other part violent. She said Robert had been under a psychiatrist's care before he left Sandusky at 19 years of age. To avoid being located, Robert often charged long-distance telephone calls to his parents' home phone. At the time of the interview, the Sprouse's phone bill was approximately $2,000. Acting on information from his mother, Clayton police uncovered 5 felony warrants against Sprouse in Colorado, as well as criminal activities in Scottsdale and Phoenix, Arizona, and in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Also through his mother, police located Sprouse in Minneapolis. When Minnesota police arrested him, they found Mr. Barlow's car and various belongings, including stock certificates, jewelry, and assorted art objects. Sprouse waived extradition, and Detective Captain James Humphrey of the Clayton Police Department escorted him back to St. Louis. Sprouse admitted his guilt. He said Dufresne had nothing to do with the crime. He identified his accomplice, Bill Haynes. When Bill was arrested, he first denied any knowledge of the crime. He told police that a man named Steve Romer had given him some silver items that he believed had been taken from Mr. Barlow's condo. Police brought Sprouse in to confront Bill. According to the police report, Sprouse told Bill he had admitted everything, and that Bill should be a man and admit what he had done. The report continued that Bill then described that Sprouse held Mr. Barlow down while Bill injected him with a cleaning solution. Police stated that during this interview, Bill was the first one to identify Energene as the brand of cleaning solution used. Subsequent toxicology tests confirmed that the solution was indeed Energene. Bill denies making either of these statements. The meeting was not taped.
I never said that name. Listen, why would they come back the next day with a can and ask me what's this says? If I said it first and said it that night and confessed, which I did not, and they don't have any type of confession, and surely the room would have been with a camera, and surely the room would have had sound, and surely somebody would have been taking down notes and showed it to me and had me sign it. And then to come back the next day over to the jail, and at the jail say, "Have you ever seen this before? Do you know what it is?"
Bill volunteered that he had left the stolen objects in his mother's home and called to tell her that the police were coming to get them and where they could be found. The police report did not document any statement about the murder. Police never recorded any of Bill's interviews, nor did they ever ask him to sign a written statement. 3 witnesses were unable to identify him in a lineup. The case rested on Bill's undocumented confession. The police interviewed Sprouse 7 times over the next few months, all of which were either audio taped or videotaped. Mark Dufresne, Sprouse's nurse boyfriend, turned himself into the police and was identified in a lineup as being with Sprouse the night of the murder. He was released and was never charged. There is no documentation to explain this. With Bill under arrest and in the St. Louis County Jail, he turned to his family to hire an attorney.
There again, we had never had cause for a lawyer. None of us had ever been in any kind of trouble whatsoever. Bill either. We've never had a lawyer. All of a sudden he needs one. Would he get one, you know? So my sister heard about this Mr. Gomrick, and he was right there in town, and she called him, and he said that he could practice in Missouri too. Okay. I am so dumb about such as this. I thought all lawyers are good, you know, that you don't need one above the other.
As often occurs, this criminal case was decided through a plea bargain.
The person who's officially responsible for making decisions about a plea bargain is the prosecutor. Maybe one person has prior criminal convictions and one person doesn't. You would want to use the person with less convictions against the person with more convictions. That would make sense. I mean, they're really kind of common sense. Again, though, there's no guidelines anywhere that says, you know, who should testify against who and who should get a better deal. I mean, it's completely discretionary.
The prosecution chose to bargain with Sprouse. He avoided the death penalty by agreeing to plead guilty to first-degree murder and to testify against Bill. Bill pleaded not guilty and opted for a jury trial. In the months before the trial, Attorney Gomrick had met with Bill twice for a total of less than 2 hours. Bill was frustrated by the lack of contact with his attorney.
You have to build a relationship with your client, which cannot be done in less than 2 hours. It can't be done in 2 hours. It can't be done in 2 weeks. If you don't have a good relationship with your client, you can't help them to make good decisions. That absence of a meaningful attorney-client relationship really prejudices the client's chances for success in resolution of their case.
Gomrick never contacted any of the witnesses Bill provided.
When I'd call his office, I would get a secretary or someone that he's very busy. I'd say, well, ask him this such and such. She'd come back on and she'd say, he said he'd contact you in a little while.
But he never did. The trial began on Monday, June 14, 1982, in the Circuit Court of St. Louis County, Judge John Rickoff presiding. Stephen Goldman, one of the top prosecutors in the county prosecutor's office, represented the state. The trial took 5 days. Day 1, Monday, was jury selection. On Tuesday, the jury was sworn in, opening statements were made, and the prosecution's case began. Testimony from state witnesses lasted until Thursday afternoon. Key testimony came from Sprouse and from the Clayton Police Department. Sprouse testified that he complained to Bill Haynes about Mr. Barlow's possessiveness. He said that Bill needed money for a restaurant, so Bill's solution to both problems was to murder Mr. Barlow and steal his belongings. He said that on the night of the murder, Bill appeared at the condo, jumped on Mr. Barlow, and injected him with cleaning fluid. Sprouse, in a state of terror and under the influence of cocaine, did nothing to stop him. Captain Humphrey, of the Clayton Police Department, who led the investigation, testified about the confrontation he orchestrated between Sprouse and Bill Haynes on November 6th. He stated that, until Bill Haynes identified Energene, the medical examiner had been unable to determine the injected chemical that caused Mr. Barlow's death. Captain Humphrey also testified about the telephone conversation Bill had with his mother that evening. According to Humphrey, Bill said, "No, that is not all. It's worse than that. Tell Allison to bring my medication to jail and to bring my prayer book and to pray for me." The prosecutor characterized this statement as a confession because Bill didn't say, "They're falsely accusing me," or "I didn't do it." Bill's mother waited outside the courtroom throughout the trial to contradict the prosecutor's interpretation.
I wanted to testify that he did not, and I had to stay out there through the whole thing, and then he come out there and told me, "Miss Laurie, our lawyer, said I decided not to use you."
The prosecutor called other witnesses, but based his case on the police captain's testimony and Sprouse's story. He rested his case early on Thursday afternoon. Defense Attorney Gomrick recalled police officers who had testified for the prosecution, but failed to bring out any new information.
I think there was a lot of testimony more by the prosecution on the method used. And it was a very unusual method of murder to inject someone with cleaning fluid. Very unusual. The defense made little or no effort to try to prove or disprove who would have had the means to do that. For example, Mr. Dufresne, who lives in and out of the apartment with Mr. Sprouse, was a nurse.
Gomrich called Gary Smith to testify after seeing him in the courtroom gallery. Gomrich had not previously interviewed Gary or prepared this line of questioning.
He didn't ask very many questions of me. And it seemed like the prosecuting attorney was the one that won on my situation.
Bill Haynes then took the stand. He recalled that Steve Romer had offered to help him find investors for a restaurant.
There was no relationship of any kind other than me believing in my mind there was going to be a restaurant to be opened by these partners and his uncle, and they wanted to run it and use it as a tax write-off, and when it started making money, then sell it. And they were interested in selling it to me.
On Wednesday, October 28th, Steve called Bill at about 9:15 p.m.
He said, well, my uncle and his other two partners are here at the house, and they'd like you to come on over. Oh, my uncle's on the phone. If you don't mind, just step down to the other door, I'll let you in. He finally opened the door. I stepped into what was this little foyer in front of me. Bill, you've wanted to meet my uncle, here he is. And he steps aside, and here's an old man, dead in this chair, slumped down. And he said, Bill, nothing will happen to you. I really like you, but I need a horse. Do you know what that means? A horse is someone that carries, someone that packs. He said, all I need you to do is help me get this out. And had me drag Mr. Barlow out of the living room, and I had to drag him down to the bathroom. I don't know why he wanted him drugged to the bathroom. It doesn't make any sense, but I did it.
Steve threatened Bill's life if he went to the police.
And I believe that he was capable of killing because I've already seen somebody dead that he's killed. And I believe he's capable of killing me.
Bill was desperate to speak to someone about what had happened, but could not reach his wife or his parents. The next day, Bill began to receive threatening telephone calls.
I went and answered the phone. It was a man's voice that I don't know, somebody, I can't identify it at all, and said, you know, I'm here taking care of stuff for Romer, and if something happens on him and you turn him in, I've got these addresses and the people will be killed.
For the next few days, Bill was paralyzed by fear and indecision. He was afraid to go to the police.
What should I do? What's real? What isn't real? Who can I talk to? What can I do? Then I don't hear anything. And then I see it in the paper.
Then Daniel Robert Sprouse, known to Bill as Steve Romer, was arrested in Minneapolis and returned to St. Louis. Sprouse identified Bill as the mastermind behind the murder. In hindsight, Bill realized that he should have come forward.
The guilt is that I didn't go to the police that night. That the police would have believed and understood me at that time, instead of taking this man's word for it.
The defense rested the same afternoon. On Friday, the prosecution and the defense made their closing arguments.
Well, I felt that Mr. Haynes had very poor representation. He put on no expert witnesses in his client's behalf. He didn't give very good arguments, like opening and closing arguments, whereas the prosecutor, Mr. Goldman, had a much better case that he put on, much more compelling evidence, was a better speaker, made a better appearance. So it looked like the deck was sort of stacked against the defendant just from that point of view.
The jury began deliberating at 11:40 a.m. 4 hours later, they returned with the verdict. Bill Haynes was found guilty of capital murder in the death of John Barlow.
I think Sprouse's testimony definitely did it and was the cornerstone of the case. And if not for him testifying, I'm not so sure that Haynes would have gotten convicted.
After a brief recess, court resumed with the punishment phase of the trial. The jury had to decide Bill's sentence. Prosecutor Goldman argued strenuously for the death penalty. After half an hour of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict of life in prison with the possibility of parole only after 50 years. Daniel Robert Sprouse, under his plea agreement, received a sentence of life in prison. He would be eligible for parole after as little as 12 years. The case of Bill Haynes proceeded through the appeals process from St. Louis County to the state of Missouri to the Federal Court of Appeals. His family paid Gomrich, the defense attorney, $5,000 to file the appeal, but it was never filed. Bill was in prison for 4 years before he discovered this. The family then hired a new defense attorney, Richard Sindell, who specialized in appeals. The first basic step always is to request a new trial. This step was omitted. Therefore, all later appeals had to meet a much higher standard.
It's much harder to get relief from the appellate court without a motion for new trial having been filed.
Subsequent appeals were filed, asking for a new trial on the basis that Bill's defense counsel had been so ineffective that Bill's original trial had not been fair. In a hearing, Bill's attorney presented evidence that Gomrich had spent less than 2 hours with Bill prior to the trial. Bill had no input into the trial strategy or even whether he should testify. The appeals attorney also questioned why Gomrich had not called witnesses Bill had suggested, including his mother, to rebut parts of the prosecution's case.
Why didn't you put witness A, B, and C on? Well, it was my trial strategy, and that's a catch-all for a number of decisions that defense counsel has to make during the trial.
Bill's appeals attorney tried to introduce new evidence of statements that Sprouse had made in prison.
I was celled next to Robert Daniel Sprouse. He just said Bill didn't do it. He never said he did it. He just said Bill was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was definitely planning to testify for Bill.
He made a deal with the prosecutor that he would testify against Bill and that the prosecution would not seek the death penalty against him. And that he said that that was a lie, that Bill had nothing to do with the murder. And that he wanted to, he says, who can I tell this to?
Shortly after Sprouse made these statements, he died in prison. Therefore, this evidence was considered hearsay and was not admissible in Bill's appeals. Sprouse's public defender, Mary Dames Fox, appeared at Bill's hearing, but refused to testify to specifics because of attorney-client privilege. She stated that Gomrich should have been able to impeach Sprouse in the original trial. She suggested that either defense attorney Gomrich was incompetent or that prosecutor Goldman had not fully disclosed Sprouse's background to the defense. Fox also testified that Clayton Police Captain Humphrey had aggressively approached her about getting Sprouse to agree to a plea bargain and to testify against Haynes. The appeals decisions found that even if Gomrich had been ineffective, the outcome of the trial would have been the same.
The trial judge is not going to second guess the trial strategy of defense counsel unless there's some glaringly large reason for it.
In 2002, a 3-judge panel in the Federal Court of Appeals heard the case. 2 of the 3 judges upheld the sentence. The 3rd judge, Donald O'Brien, disagreed. He researched the case and discovered that Gomrich had been disbarred in 1998 in Missouri and Illinois for poor representation of clients dating back to the 1970s.
It's my belief that Haynes hasn't had a lawyer from the very beginning. The state of Missouri was quick to disbar him for all kinds of reasons, 10 or so bad ones. I was looking at the standards for the American bar for defense attorneys, and I found about 10 things in there that his lawyer didn't do, such as establish a relationship with the accused, interviewing the client, prompt action to protect the accused, duty to keep the client informed, duty to investigate, compliance with discovery problems. I've been a judge for 22 years, and I think this guy had the worst lawyer that I've ever run into. And you think that the state of Missouri should say, well, heck, tough. He may be guilty. Maybe he ought to die over it. But His lawyer had never tried a criminal case in Missouri and didn't tell anybody that. He also said, I was at the preliminary hearing, and that should help to show how close I was to my client, but there wasn't any preliminary hearing. He was a liar and a thief. He took $5,000 and never did anything for it. It's a sad deal.
Daniel Robert Sprouse died in prison in 1988 at age 33 after serving approximately 7 years. The prison rumor is that he died of an overdose of pure cocaine, either as a suicide or a murder. Mark Dufresne died of AIDS at age 36 in 1988. Gary Smith lives in St. Louis, is still a waiter, and continues to write to Bill Haynes. Attorney Gordon Freese took over the Bill Haynes case in 2002. He represents Bill on a pro bono basis. Only the United States Supreme Court remains a legal option. However, it is unlikely that the Supreme Court would hear a case that does not test constitutional law. A request for pardon to the governor of the state of Missouri may be the only remaining recourse. Bill Haynes remains in prison. He will not be eligible for parole until 2032, when he is 86 years old.